Hi, everyone. This is a recording that goes over the paper entitled Towards an Interactional Approach to Sustainable Community Development. And it's in the set of readings. It's a paper by two authors, Bridger and Luloff, and it appeared in the Journal of Rural Studies in 1999. Um, I mentioned the date and the place where this appeared because when you're reading a paper, that's an important first thing to pay attention to. So, is this a recent paper? What time period was it published? What's changed since then? And also, what audience was it written for? So, 1999. Not recent, right? So 20 years ago. And the Journal of Rural Studies, probably you haven't had much reason to read anything in the Journal of Rural Studies. These are two sociologists, but they think a lot about communities, that is rural studies, a lot about communities and a lot about communities that depend a lot on location. So just a kind of some of the ideas about why something like this would have appeared in that kind of a forum. This is this paper is, I think, in some ways accessible to you as undergraduates, at least in the early parts of the paper. It may be a bit intimidating. It's not super long, but it's not short either. And it has a number of concepts that are probably unfamiliar. In this first lecture section, I'm going to talk through sections 1, 2, and 3, and then I'll record a second lecture that goes on from there. So when we look at this paper, it starts out by making the case that, and again, 1999, that it's pretty well acknowledged that human actions have an impact on the environment, and that they can threaten the long-term health, and kind of getting over the hurdle of having many people acknowledge that is an important one, and then sets up a potential to do something about it. Also, it broadens the idea of sustainability as not just being good to the environment or having economic growth. It tries to break free of that way of pitting those two things against each other. And as you'll see here, there's reference to the Brundtland Commission report, which you were also reading, that really speaks to both what we do in the present, and the impact that has in the future. So the paper then goes on to present two different views of sustainable development, and we really need to talk about sustainable development before we can talk about sustainable community development. So and both of them have this notion of the present and the future, also referred to as intergenerational equity. So intergenerational meaning from one generation to the next, and equity meaning some form of fairness across generations. So the notion being that we don't want to do things today that mean that future generations will have many fewer options than we have, or will have many more problems than we have based on our actions now. So these two views about how to achieve sustainability and therefore produce different definitions for sustainable development are I think pretty interesting to read, and also relatively accessible. So in one model of constrained economic growth, the kind of underlying tenet is that growth is the objective. So growth is good, that we should try to create as much growth as possible, and that the way that we take into account the considerations of sustainability is that that's a constraint. So growth is what you're trying to maximize, subject to a constraint that has to do with the way that you utilize natural resources. And this definition may be quite comfortable for engineers, for people who are comfortable and enjoy simplifying the world to a mathematical equation, or simplifying action to a utility maximization, because it very much has that flavor. And so this definition gets critique in the sense that it continues to advocate for growth, and doesn't sort of doesn't acknowledge that there may be what's often called a carrying capacity for the environment, meaning that there is no untethered growth path that makes sense. So it's not a matter of subject to constraint. There's a fundamental issue that the environment only has so much capacity, and if we pursue growth, that we are going to run into a limit. So that's a critique of this constrained growth approach. So a second definition, as it says in the paper, it comes from the notion of resource maintenance. And so this is sort of a reaction to the criticisms of the constrained growth approach, and instead says that we should focus on minimizing impact on the environment by limiting the use of natural resources, while also meeting the material needs of people. So this attempts to put on an equal level the impact on environment and the meeting of needs. So the limiting natural resource use is made into a sort of explicit goal, not a constraint. And it makes a distinction here, an important distinction between people's needs and desires. So if you're going to limit resource use, then you really have to ask what kinds of uses are going to be, what's the hierarchy of uses, what uses are going to be considered acceptable, and what kinds of uses will you try to reduce, so that you get these limited burden on natural resources. And this issue of needs and wants is a really tricky one. Ask yourself, what do you need, and at what point have you switched over to things that you don't need but are wants, and so that's tricky for sure. There's no super easy answer there. One of the things that is interesting in this particular section, this is the section 2.2, is that there is some reference to technology. So I'll just read this quote at the beginning of this paragraph and then get to the part about technology. So the resource maintenance approach requires a fundamental rethinking of our relationship to the environment, consumption patterns, and standards of living. Standards of living is where that some of this issue of need versus want comes into play. That paragraph goes on to say that among the changes that are called for in the resource maintenance approach are the use of simple and appropriate technology whenever possible. I think the emphasis that you should read there is simple technologies and appropriate technologies. That is not, this kind of puts technology, asks that technology be used because it is a particular lever in a situation, but not that it's sort of used unthoughtfully and in complex unjustified ways. So there's some complexity in this section that I'm going to confess I don't completely I don't easily understand it by a quick read. So the paragraph that says working from the proposition that sustainable development socially can be discerned in part by working from the dynamics of ecosystems. It took me a few reads to try to get something out of that, and I think the key here is that is referencing the way that natural complex ecosystems operate as forming a model for how social systems that naturally do interact with the environment might also be structured, and it has to do with thinking about the full system. So the things that you consume and what happens after that, and does the pattern of consumption taken broadly support the continued health of the system that is producing what you're consuming. So in the ways that nature can replenish itself, this sort of advocating that sustainable development for people should try to follow the dynamics of ecosystems that have a regeneration, have a stability, can adapt to and withstand certain kinds of shocks, because there is a robustness built into the system. So that's that second definition. And this definition very clearly acknowledges that the earth is finite and non-growing, and so therefore any physical subsystem, including human subsystem, eventually needs to become, and they use the phrase non-growing, which is kind of interesting. Instead of saying has to stop growing, well, non-growing sort of says it could be flat. That would be all right. And then there is some kind of thinking here that sustainable growth then is potentially reads as a contradiction. So how can you continue to grow and retain sustainability if there's an upper limit, a kind of carrying capacity of the natural system? So so that's sections 1 and 2. I think I'm going to stop here, and then I will do a second video on section 3 and then go on from there.